Hi, I'm Laura Martin. This is my extra credit video for food chemistry spring 2013, and I'm going to be talking about grains and legumes. First, I'll talk about grains. Some of the major cereal crops for grains are wheat, corn, rice, barley, oats, and rye. They can be used as a food for us or like as a feed for animals. They have high amounts of complex carbohydrates and proteins, and they can be consumed whole, such as a breakfast cereal, or processed, like a flour. And they have about 12 to 14% water. The cereal grain structure, the cereal is a dry one seed fruit of cultivated grasses, and the kernel or the grain is the fruit. And the grain is made up of three main parts: the bran, the endosperm, and the germ. First, I'll talk about the bran. The bran's main function is to protect the grain. It encloses the endosperm and the germ. And there can be different amounts of bran in different grains. For example, rice has about 5% bran, wheat has about 13% bran, and oat can have up to 40% bran. And the bran is a good source of dietary fibers like cellulose and hemicellulose. It's also a good source of minerals like potassium, phosphorus, magnesium, and calcium. The endosperm is made up of starch-containing cells. It makes up about 80% of the kernel weight, and the starch granules are embedded in a protein matrix. And the endosperm is a good source of pantothenic acid, riboflavin, and other minerals. The germ is the smallest part of the grain. It only makes up about 3% of the whole grain, and it's made up of carbohydrates, lipids, B vitamins, tocopherols, and enzymes. Carbohydrates make up about 65 to 75% of a grain, and starch, which is a polysaccharide, is the main carbohydrate within the grain. The size and shape of the starch depends on the plant source, but the amylose to amylopectin ratio is about the same regardless of the plant source. And the ratio is 25% amylose to 75% amylopectin, unless it is a high amylase starch, which contains about 50% amylose, or if it is a waxy starch, which has 2% or less of amylose, which means that waxy starches are very high in amylopectin. Starches also have the ability to gel in a grain. Gelatinization occurs when water is absorbed after heating. The starch granule swells, and disruption of the crystalline structure of the starch granule occurs, and then amylose is released. And retrogradation of a starch is the reassociation of the gelatinized starch. And gelling of a starch occurs through the formation of the 3D network of amylose molecules through hydrogen bonds, and the gel forms upon cooling and traps large amounts of water. Other carbohydrates in grains are polysaccharides and sugars. Polysaccharides are cell wall polysaccharides that are dietary fibers, such as cellulose, hemicellulose, beta glucans, but they are low in pectins. And sugars include sucrose and raffinose. The sugars make up about 2% of the kernel weight and are located in the germ. Proteins make up about 7 to 12% of the cereal grain, and they include albumins, globulins, prolamins, and glutenins. Gluten is a dough-forming protein structure that is made up of gliadin and glutenin. Gliadins are prolamins that exist as single polypeptide chains. They're high in hydrophobic amino acid and contain about 15% proline. Gliadins are a compact globular molecule that has intramolecular bonding and is responsible for the elasticity of the dough. And glutenin is made up of glutenin, and subunits are associated through intra and inter-disulfide bridges. Glutenin is a large extended molecule that has intramolecular bonding and is responsible for strength and cohesiveness of the dough. In wheat flour, glutenin and gliadin make up 85 to 90% of protein. They associate to form gluten after hydration and mechanical manipulation, like when you're making the dough, you knead the dough. That's the type of manipulation it needs. And the gluten's functional properties depend on water binding capacity, and the hydration of gluten is due to hydrogen bonds, and polar amino acids allow the proteins to be hydrated. Some non-dough forming proteins, an example would be albumins and globulins. They are water soluble and make up about 15% of the total proteins in the grain, and they are a good source of enzymes and enzyme inhibitors. Different flours, they can have different amounts of gluten and protein in them. Cake flour has the lowest gluten content, then pastry flour has slightly more. All-purpose flour has an intermediate amount of gluten in it, and durum flour has the highest protein content of any flour. And any minerals that are lost during the milling, the flour is fortified so with minerals that are lost to replace them. Lipids make up about 2 to 8% of the kernel weight. Overall, grains are good sources of B vitamins and tocopherols. Now I will talk about legumes. Legumes are seeds that are harvested in pods. They can be consumed as mature dry seeds like beans, as immature green seeds like sweet peas, or as immature seeds in pods like green beans. Legumes are high in protein, and some have a very high oil content. And they also have about 10 to 50% water, and they can be categorized as oil seeds and pulses. Oil seeds have a very high oil content. They can have about 20 to 50% oil in them, and they contain about 20 to 40% proteins. Some examples of oil seeds are soybeans, peanuts, or cotton seeds. And pulses are a very good source of protein, and some examples are kidney beans, lima beans, or other starchy legumes. The legume structure, they are made up of carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids. Carbohydrates make up 10 to 50% of the legume, and of those carbohydrates, starches make up 20 to 70% of the kernel weight, and they are very high in amylose. And oligosaccharides like raffinose make up 30 to 75% of the total sugars. Proteins make up about 5 to 25% of the legumes, and they make up 20 to 50% of the kernel weight. In legumes, proteins are mostly storage proteins, but some can also be structural proteins. In raw beans and uncooked legumes, they can contain lectins and glycoproteins, which can be toxic, and they have the ability to agglomerate red blood cells, which means it causes the red blood cells to form a mass. But lectins are water soluble, and they are lost during cooking and thermal processing. Lipids make up 1 to 18% of legumes. They can make up 1 to 3% to 20 to 50% of the kernel weight, and they can be triglycerides, phospholipids, and glycolipids. And the lipids are located in membranes and in the germ. Overall, legumes are a good source of vitamins and minerals like niacin, pyridoxine, and folate, and oil seeds are high in tocopherols. And that is my extra credit video.